So the last bit of this first week of abnormality is let's look at cities, and we talked a little bit about this in class right before we got dismissed for the year. So we did talk about that cities have a lot of significant advantages, or at least they have, and they seem to be escalating those advantages over rural areas. And one of them that we've seen is that people living in urban areas tend to have higher incomes. The cost of living is also higher, but they also tend to be healthier because there tends to be more access to services. People also tend to be less sick. There tends to be fewer diseases that tend to get a foothold in cities as opposed to rural sides, which is a little counterintuitive when you think about the population density. That's playing out now maybe a little differently with this virus, so we'll see how it plays out. Now, another thing with cities is these income levels. And so when you begin to look at incomes over time, some cities are doing better than others. And generally, cities have had a higher percent of relative income than the rest of the country. Right? So the blue line here is the average across all cities. Okay. And so now when we look at Seattle, San Francisco, Atlanta, right, Boston, Washington, right, those are cities that have incomes that have kind of been consistently ahead. Boston and Chicago is sketching up. And then you see cities that are in a little bit of decline, Philadelphia and particularly Detroit, which has dropped over the years since 1980. Okay. But generally, when you look at the average for all US, it's way down here, not even on the chart. And so cities just tend to have higher incomes. Again, more industry, more things like that. It also tends to be spaces for innovation. So there's a lot of pluses for cities. And we're going to begin to see some of the inequities here in our next couple of slides. So one of the more interesting studies that we have seen with cities is studies around long-term ecological research projects. There's 3 of them going on right now: Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Baltimore, as 3 very distinct cities, particularly across their ecological spectrums. And what we're finding is that the biodiversity of a particular area in a city is very predictive of the health of people in that city. As we kind of saw back when we were talking about the Chicago 1995 heat wave. It's because if you have more parks, you're likely to have more biodiversity. But it is sometimes something that gets embedded within the structure of cities themselves, and implicit biases tend to play themselves out through nature. So what we're looking at here is a graph that shows the number and different types of plants in a particular area. Okay. And notice this linear trend here, right? As the income goes up, there's a relationship. Okay. And there's some scatter in this, so it's not a super relationship, but it's a significant enough relationship. And when the Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, they called this the luxury effect, because as income goes up, plant biodiversity goes up. Plant biodiversity has been seen as a predictor of long-term health in humans, particularly along the lifespan, as well as in terms of just standard of living. Now, we've also seen this with birds. Okay? And so here we are again. Income goes up, number of bird species. Okay? Notice general trend upward. Right? Number of park birds. Now this one is particularly interesting because that is highly correlated to this graph. So what this is birds that they did studies of biodiversity in public parks. And so what this shows is that parks in wealthier neighborhoods tend to have higher biodiversity levels than parks in low-income neighborhoods. Now this doesn't seem as a big surprise, usually because folks who live in higher income areas, they tend to have a larger voice in what happens in their particular neck of the woods in a city. But this is a policy choice that is being made. Hence, we begin to see even greater discrepancies between urban areas of wealth and urban areas of low income, because green space matters. As we saw with Chicago, it can save lives because it builds relationships between people. Right? And so there's been a lot of research on this around the value of green space. And I want to talk a little bit here right after this about green space and critters and how we can design green spaces in cities to actually make them friendly to critters, because urban spaces are sprawling, right? We're starting to see more bears, coyotes, all sorts of critters are now entering cities because we're encroaching upon their spaces, right? And so we've seen tons of resources, or tons of research that has found that people, when you have green space, anxiety levels go down. In fact, they found that in hospitals, that if you can look out and you can see a tree or some kind of green space, you can often get better significantly faster. Depends on the number of days, but if it's a week, you're usually out of the hospital 2 days earlier than if you're just in a room and you can't see any green space. Again, think about our evolution as a species. We evolved outdoors. We're used to having green space. It just makes us feel good. This is why a lot of hospitals have been trying to put back in, healing gardens, things like that. And this is particularly valuable in times like now. Right? Risk for heart disease and stroke goes down when there's access to green space. In fact, a lot of health benefits come along with having access to green space. Basically, you get outside and you do a bit more because it's a good place to be, right? It's friendly. Right? And we also tend to see that people who live in cities that are also near green space tend to just be in better shape. Again, they're out, they're moving. Again, it's just a more pleasant environment to be in. And how we do that is you just be clever about it, right? You're going to have development, right? We're going to build things. We're going to have shops, right? We're going to have buildings. So you just try to make them inviting, right? So you don't have a building that goes right up to the curb, right? You have trees and you have places for people to sit, right? And so we know how to do this well. The problem to do that well, right, is you're taking this space away from retail space. And so there's an issue around monetary return on space investment, right? Is that if you can get more square foot, you can charge more for it. Yeah, but you want to have something that's inviting. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about here is, and we won't go into this in a lot of depth, but what we're going to do for our discussion this week is we're going to watch a TED Talk by Glazer. He's a professor over at Harvard, and he wrote a book, The Triumph of the City. It's a very, very nice book that talks about the value of cities and why we've underestimated cities in the development of our society and the value of them in innovation and creativity. And so we want to discuss those and see if he's right, because some of his ideas can be a little striking in terms of data. So that's why I want to talk about this. But cities are complicated, right? They've got these social economic drivers, right? They've got these human activities. We've got demographic patterns, as we saw in class. Right? You have segregation in cities, right? There's all sorts of hierarchies, which is correlated to wealth, as we saw even with our biodiversity. And then we have the ecosystem itself. And then we have geophysical drivers, which is like rivers and information flow in and out of a city. And all of these things begin to interact with each other to begin to create the city. And it's complicated, and it creates a lot of complex interactions within a city. And to a certain extent, we've kind of let some cities go a little bit amok in that they have focused so much on the development. So this is a picture of Hong Kong, right? And so Hong Kong has expanded all the way around its estuary. There is no green space left or open space left in Hong Kong. There's green space, but there isn't any place else left to build. So when you go look at the maps of Hong Kong as it's growing, it only has one direction to grow. It either has to grow up or it has to grow inland, right? So it's sprawling a fair bit. And sprawl is an issue. So we lived in Washington, D.C. for quite some time. So every now and then we would make it out here to Tyson's Corner. It's, it's a little area right outside D.C. A lot of defense contractors are there and so forth and so on. And rule number one was you never drove. And tried to figure out some other way out there because it was a little bit of a nightmare to get there. Even though it was only like 10 miles away, it still took like 4.5 years. Okay. Now, what this leads to isn't just all the issues around air quality and things like that. It leads to habitat fragmentation. And that has some issues around for critters. And one of the challenges is when habitats become fragmented, it's very difficult for butterflies, caterpillars, bees, you name it, to be able to have a large enough and connected habitat for them to thrive. We even see this with birds. And so when you have fragmentation in habitats, particularly if it's divided by roads, one of the challenges that you run into is edge effects, because birds, they tend to like to stay inland, right? They tend to like to stay, where they're not going to be eaten, so, by trees and thicker grasses, right? So the cat won't find them. However, one of the challenges is that if your habitat isn't very big and it's close to an edge, right, it's easier for the predator to quickly dive into the edge and get you and then come back out. So what we're beginning to see is we're beginning to see these type of patterns begin to emerge, right? So you usually start off with a nice big closed open space. You get some agricultural development or other development, things like that. Now you can see where the roads are, right? Because they have trees right along the roads. And then eventually, where you're down here, where now you've got just a couple of homesteads, right? You've got some roads, right? Now you just got a big farm. So you go from this, which probably was very animal wealth in terms of biodiversity, to here, which is animal poor in terms of biodiversity. So how can we fix this? As there are ways, and you can actually have fairly robust spaces in cities to be able to host critters. Right? So we just talked about it. So you can have a forest, which is, that's the ideal, right? But we have to, as a society, right, we have development, we have cities. So how can we have the city be supportive of the wildlife that used to live in part of the development where the city is, as opposed to thinking of them as being at odds with each other? Okay? So you have these models. And so in a city, you can have spaces, okay? And so, of course, having a bigger size is always better, generally, but when you're stuck in a city, right, that tends to be a lot harder to do. And one of the things and areas that cities tend to make mistakes in is they tend to have these spots that are scattered. So they have a green space, one part of the city, a green space, another part of the city, green space, another part of the city, green space, another part of the city. Right? So this is more common. And in many cities, this third one is even more common, right? You get green spaces that are scattered apart. So if you're a poor butterfly over here and you need to get over here, the likelihood of you making this journey is slim. The likelihood of you making that journey not being eaten is even slimmer. So begin to think about creating connecting corridors. So if you go online and you Google, you'll see where some states are putting corridors over roadways. So instead of bridges, they're green space that allows deer and other animals to pass over the road without having to go through the road. So that saves the drivers, and that also prevents animals from getting separated from one another, and their habitats in particular from getting separated from one another. So when you have a connected reservoir like this, it's almost as good as having a big space like this. Right? And in cities, you're more likely to have lots of smaller spaces. But if you can connect them, you're better. Okay? And then even better is if you can create little buffer zones around them. Okay? So let's look how people have done this. So there's been lots of studies. So I'm going to steal this one that was published in South Carolina, where they did a research project. And so they looked at different sites. And so they basically created habitats so that they could see in particular how birds and butterflies and insects and things like that survived within a habitat that looked like this versus a habitat that was connected between the two, and then just one that was off isolated by itself. So what did they find? So let's look at our butterflies. Not surprisingly, they found that butterflies in this connected space tended to move around more. That also meant that you had more berries on plants and things like that. Because as we sometimes forget, butterflies are actually pollinators, right? And so that's why we're in trouble when butterflies are starting to diminish, like the monarch is starting to head down. And notice that the even the winged that had a little bit of a connector space that allowed you to go out and then jump off to maybe to the next spot, right? The problem there that you ran into was edge effects. Right, so when you go back over here, right, this has a lot of edge, and that's what they were kind of testing with these guys. And then when you look at the rectangular, that's the one just by itself. Okay, so you can have a butterfly that can live in the middle. But again, the best one was these connector spaces. Okay, and again, you're going to run into a little edge effects as you're going from one connected space to another connected space, but it is a lot better than just having a single connected space. Okay. Now, one of the cities that I would like for you guys to go Google and look at is Curitiba, Brazil, and there's a couple of cities in Colombia as well that are actually very good eco cities. And Majora Carter talks about one of them in her TED Talk that we had you guys watch. But some of the things that are interesting is that they would only, it was heavily zoned, and so only apartment complexes that were tall were allowed near bus stops or any kind of centralized public transportation. Bike paths are everywhere, and cars are banned from 49 blocks of the city downtown. So that makes it a much more walkable city space. Right? And so then you can take your bike in, or you get off at one of the hubs and you just walk into the city. What this has led to is 70% of the population, and there's 2 million people that live in this city, use the bus system. Right? So it's a very nice city. It's worth Googling and learning more about. Right? And what they've done is they've created this interesting kind of mini city spikes. And so you have, again, in the center, it's going to be more expensive to live as it is there. But they've created these bike lanes to the core population areas, and they've connected them to each other. So you can go in and out, and you can go between. So what that also does is it reduces congestion inside the city. So when you look at a lot of US cities, they're built on a hub and spoke model where you have a central city, and then you have information going out or just in. And so it's either in or out. Here, they've got work going on in the core, and then they've got these satellite little mini cities that are also have their own semi-mini ecosystems, and they are connected to each other too, as well as connected to the inner core. So this is a reasonably good urban plan model for a city. And we can do this in the United States because of just the nature of our hub and spokes. If we begin to think about development and placing large public transportation sites at key locations, like in Boston, Massachusetts Planning Council has an idea, and they have a plan that they've written about having a big transportation hub roughly placed at where 90 and 128 intersect with each other, as well as where 93 and 128 intersect with each other, and then where 90 or where 128 splits off at 93 on the south side, because those are big bottlenecks in terms of traffic. But if they become hub points where you can go and you can take a train in, then it becomes much more manageable as a city. All right, so what I'm going to want you guys to do, and I'm going to bring it up here, is, let me bring down the window in here. So for our discussion around all of this, as the previous 10-minute segments were more focused on kind of hopefully lay a little bit of a background for it. And so this was a TED Talk that didn't get aired when it showed up, but it's pretty good. And so this is, again, Ed Glazer. He's a Harvard faculty member. He's an economist that focuses on cities. And what I would like for us to do is watch this talk. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to talk about it and figure out, what can we do with cities, and how can cities be seen as one of the core solutions to a number of issues, and where they are also got some challenges that they have to overcome. And that is going to be our kind of first week of activities, coupled with learning about the Solar Energy Lab.